Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on navigating the future of embodied carbon in the built environment. My name is Jeremy Sung, and I'm the Head of Policy at the Energy Efficiency Council. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we're all meeting from today. In my case, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. And I'd like to acknowledge any traditional elders on the call, and elders past and present as well. So today we are discussing embodied carbon, and you'll notice there's two logos on the holding page we have here, the EEC's one, but also this EBC logo. So I thought it's worth me giving a bit of background as to what the EBC is and why we're here today. Well, EBC stands for Energy in Buildings and Communities, and it's one of the IEA, the International Energy Agency's technology collaboration programs. What this means is it's a program whereby countries pool their resources and conduct collaborative research that benefits countries across the world. Australia is a really active participant in the IEA's technology collaboration program more broadly, and in the EBC in particular, we send several researchers to take part and share their knowledge and insights and learn from others as well. The Energy Efficiency Council helps to coordinate Australia's participation in the IEA's EBC collaboration program. And this webinar is part of efforts to help spread information coming out of the collaboration so that researchers and policymakers in Australia can benefit from the world-leading research taking place through the program. So we're very excited today to have some speakers. Well, first of all, I should mention Greg Foliente in the center of the screen there is one of the members of the IEA EBC's annexes, and they're called annexes, but what I refer to there is research projects. He takes part in several of the EBC's research projects, and particularly those related to embodied carbon and whole of life cycle emissions. So we're very glad to have Greg joining us today, and he's going to be kicking off proceedings shortly. But we also have Monica here from MECLA and Katie from NABERS, and I'll introduce them more fully just before they present. But needless to say, we have some real experts on the topic of embodied carbon in the built environment, and so I'm very happy to be welcoming them today on this panel. I can see the attendees have gone up to 50, so that's great. Thank you for joining us and the interest in this webinar. And it just reflects, I think, how much interest there is on this topic. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Greg. Actually, there is one more thing. I should mention a bit of housekeeping before we get into the content. The Q&A function of Zoom is where we would ask you to pose your questions to the panel, and the chat function I think is disabled. But please put your questions in the Q&A function there, and also read through the questions. If there are questions you want to see answered by the panel, upvote them, and we'll make sure that we get to those first. So what we're going to do today is each presenter will present for around 13 to 15 minutes. Then we'll have a bit of a panel discussion, and we'll be taking and answering your questions in that second session. So I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, Greg Foliente. Greg, you might want to switch your camera on and get set while I'm doing this. So Greg is an Enterprise Professor of Sustainable and Resilient Built Environment at the University of Melbourne. He is President and Chair of the Board for the non-for-profit International Initiative for a Sustainable Built Environment. He's co-chair of the World Sustainable Built Environment Conference, and is one of the leaders of the IEA EBC's Annex 89, which is a research project focused on ways to implement net zero whole of life carbon buildings. As a scholar of global standing, he's listed in Stanford University's world ranking of top 2% of scientists based on his Scopus database publications, and is a recipient of the prestigious James Crowe's Medal from the American Society of Civil Engineers. So he's well placed to present on this topic, and a real leader and contributor to global research on the topic. And I'd like to welcome Greg, and take it away, Greg.
Thank you, Jeremy. If you can view my slides, that means we're set. Yes?
We're good.
Okay, let me just take the panel out of the way. So I will provide this afternoon some of the international and context that brought us to the present, and some of the movements moving forward, activities and plans moving forward, especially in IEA, but also in particular Europe. So to complement some of the information that we're going to get from our other speakers. So we are here because it's a hot topic across government and agencies and industries around the world. But let me go back to Copenhagen COP15 in 2009. We just finished COP28, and this reminded me that in 2009 we launched the Common Carbon Metric. I was a consultant with the UNEP at the time, and I led an international effort to do this. And this Common Carbon Metric was widely adopted or supported by green building councils and associations, but we made a very explicit decision at that time to exclude embodied carbon because of many issues that we know are not resolved or difficult to do at that time. So today we focus on embodied carbon and the placement of this in the scheme of the framework in the European standard EN 15643. Is that the previous common carbon metric is the blue on operational B61 to B8 or to B6.2 and 6.3, where the embodied carbons, the green boundary, which includes the upfront emissions, A1 to A5. So particular to this, of course, is the development of ISO 14000 family of standards back in the 1990s. And there are many countries that don't have LCA databases. And so I was involved with the UNEP Life Cycle Initiative to develop guidelines for countries on how to develop life cycle assessment databases, depending on where they are in the development of data, for example. And back in 2011, the first IEA on the topic was born. And this went for 5 years. And this was the initial salvo on systematically looking the embodied energy and carbon emissions for building and construction. And I was part of the leadership of this annex that led to some of the early papers on how to incorporate this with other elements of design and planning, and how to view different stakeholder decision making. Among others, in this previous annex, we look at the different variation of energy mix and greenhouse gas emission intensity. And you can see that for different countries, because of their energy production, the intensity look quite different. And therefore, you cannot really use some of these data sets that because the profile are very different. When during that time, most of the Australian consultants are using UK databases, for example, in Australian projects. So the idea is how to make this work, especially in countries that don't have these kinds of problems or information. So we did a lot of building stock modeling as well in Australia during that period, and new buildings, but also when you look at building stock, of course, the importance of existing buildings and the balance between operating carbon and embodied carbon, and the different types of data sets using from top-down, input-output, hybrid, and process-based. And we, for example, compare their implications when you use them for example, in this case, residential buildings in Australia, the kinds of differences you'll get between process, input-output, or hybrid. And there are certain reasons for this. In commercial buildings, for example, you'd see again the differences in some of these things, and to provide guidance, because one size does not fit all purposes. And there's a role for all these types of different data sets to answer different questions of different stakeholder groups and decision makers, because these stakeholder groups have different role in the industry and in the ecosystem, and they have this different decision-making context. And depending on what decision you need to make, you may need a certain data set to make it give you a big picture whether it's input-output. Certain decisions may need a hybrid approach. And for individual products and design, for example, you may want to do process-based approach. And so the idea here really is when and how you'd be able to make what do you need in terms of decisions. And so we provided some initial thinking on this matter in this previous Annex. And then, of course, in 2016, we have Annex 72, which look at the life cycle and the integration, better integration to the processes of design, planning, and code development. And so we had to do a lot of benchmarking and case studies and development of tools. It led to what's called the Monte Verita Declaration. And again, you can see that we focus on different actors and stakeholders in this Monte Verita Declaration out of Annex 72. Because for the same reason that we started in Annex 57, that different stakeholders need different information. And the reports from Annex 72, they're very substantial. You'd probably need 3 months to read all of the reports. But we've summarized them courtesy of Professor Lutzkendorf from Germany, who was one of the leaders, my co-leader in 57, but one of the leaders also 72, and the next one that we are in, which is Annex 89. So for example, had a set of checklists for a framework on embodied carbon out of the work of Annex 72 on a model of the building and the life cycle of the indicators to use and clarification on these matters. The LCA rules for bio-based products and biogenic carbon, allocation rules for embodied impacts of BIPV systems. Reference study period turned out to be very, very critical and account for most of the differences of different systems in different countries. The replacement scenario service life is affected by the reference study period, and end of life, including biogenic carbon, is quite important. And of course, how to deal with the changing energy mix over the horizon. This is critical and difficult. And then, of course, the rules for discounting and offsetting. They need clarity. So then, according to these stakeholders, just present you a few things related to 3 important stakeholders, policymakers, to develop a national method for environmental performance assessment, introduce legally binding requirements to limit greenhouse emissions in the full life cycle of new constructions and of refurbishment of existing buildings by 2025, latest with a roadmap to net zero by 2035. This was the recommendation from Annex 72 that we also tried to push in the COP28 through different organizations. Think about requirement to limit use of natural resources, introducing guiding values for embodied emissions, including specific values for upfront emissions, introduce a legally binding requirement to communicate environmental construction product information, and provide a national database for environmental product information. These are general recommendations across the world. For clients and designers, of course, follow a sufficiency strategy and efficiency that follows that. So if we don't need to build things, then we shouldn't. Reuse or repurpose existing buildings, include embodied carbon related requirements into client's brief. Some pretty standard and probably common sense recommendations, deconstruction, recycling, low carbon products, of course, and education and applied life cycle assessment. Now, for product manufacturers, provide products serve specific information related to average and minimum service life. This is the one that usually is not provided. I have some caveat on this one because things are replaced sometimes not because they're just because not because of it's not working. Sometimes they're replaced because of aesthetic or choice. Whole life greenhouse emissions, environmental impacts, of course, sometimes done through, most of the time through EPD. And so this becomes more important for early design stages in particular. And provide take-back options, increase content of recycled materials, and then provide their own decarbonization strategies in forecast. So these were the teams that moved to 89. Annex 89 now is very big. You can see that the setting of the picture is exactly the same because that was Aalborg University in Copenhagen. That photo on the right was taken a couple of months ago. And the EBC has a website, so you would like more information. I'm the lead. I'm in the core leadership of this annex, and I'm the lead for subtask 1 on developing guidelines for different countries and recommendation on establishing carbon reduction paths and action towards net zero. That's fine. And so the idea is to guide countries how to develop these net zero whole life carbon roadmaps. Certain countries have already this kind of roadmaps. The UK, for example, Ireland, for example, and this is the indirect emissions, direct emissions, and embodied emissions for the whole sector of the built construction. So obviously you would have carbon reduction targets and budgets forward to 2050 and earlier. You'd have the kinds of the measures that you monitor and assess over that period, both at the sector level, but also individual projects. And then you would have a set of intervention schemes, instruments and actions. And then of course, the stakeholders that need to make those decisions and actions. So this is the scope in a way for our roadmaps. And the scope also of Annex 89. And so we are pushing for science-based targets. So the Australian example, for example, you can compare the nationally determined contribution from a fair share to a science-based target and find out the gap and what you need to do. Germany has a similar one on the right on tracking how much we need to be doing. And of course, we can also take into account the fact that there are macroeconomic cross-sectoral considerations that are reported in input-output tables of national statistics. That's not in the building and construction industry sector, that may be in manufacturing or transport, that need to be accounted for as well, which is very important. So we have some research-based roadmaps like this one produced by the CRC Low Carbon Living, led by UNSW some time ago. And then, of course, we need to assess this in terms of the specific actions and directions and progress within Australia. There are models that we can use, top-down models that they try to do in the United States. And the ones, for example, one of my PhD students doing is a bottom-up model for a whole life decarbonization of residential building stock that takes into account household decision behavior, for example. The intervention schemes can be sticks, a whole set of them, different types. They can be carrots and incentives or tambourines, which are education and training. These are the categories of intervention that UNEP identified some time ago. And then, of course, the decision makers are very important because they have different roles, as I said. The rule makers, including policy and regulators, the rule followers that need to abide by those, and what for lack of a better word, what I call rule jokers, because they are the ones that, depending on their decisions, can tip the balance, whether it's harder or easier for the transition to happen. And one of the things that I'm leading to develop is what we call the capability maturity framework for net zero whole life carbon implementation in different countries. Again, it's a country level. And the idea is look at the governance structure, the technology and data, and the people resources in each country, so they can map where they are and where they'd like to be. And each country can map according to this, so that you can compare, if you like to be example, to see what's going in Europe, which is the most advanced in terms of development. The Netherlands, Denmark, the Nordic countries in particular, France and Germany and Switzerland have a lot of these. And so they already have developed the typical values for embodied carbon for different types of buildings, for example, in the region, but also country by country. And that's why in Denmark, they can set their national regulation and have this progressive plan on how to address the improvement of standards, benchmarks to make for their embodied carbon as part of the national regulation. So they do a lot of research. On the left, you can see a lot of the papers that they produce that are then written up into industry and government report on the right. And then they translate them very quickly into standards and regulations. Now, you may have heard of the new European Bauhaus, which was an initiative in Europe in 2020. And the idea, of course, is to be sustainable using the principles of the original Bauhaus developed in Weimar in Germany. I go back to that period because 100 years ago, the local German building requirement is to reduce embodied coal. And it was the first record of minimizing embodied coal, which now it translates to embodied carbon in our case. And this is for the house, which became the first Bauhaus in Weimar. And so you can see the requirement of sustainability is on the left, and a lot of them are on saving energy efficiency and embodied coal reduction. So we have come full circle. From embodied coal 100 years ago to embodied carbon, from building to building stock to country to global, and we're going back in Annex 89 from planet to country to sector and to individual buildings. And so this is the ones that we would like to produce in Annex 89 is the guideline for each country, but also the roadmap. And that's the reason why I say we go back to the future. And I'll be glad to answer your questions later on.
Thank you, Greg. A lot of content packed into the slides, so we might have to have some questions. I've taken down some notes, so I definitely have some questions in the panel discussion. I won't ask any of them right now, and we'll hold them to the discussion. So in the meantime, I'm going to jump straight into our second presenter. I would encourage the audience to try and mull over anything you've seen there and put comments in the Q&A. Then we'll get to them in the discussion. But I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, Monica Richter. And I see you've got your camera on. Thanks, Monica. So Monica is an economist and social ecologist with extensive experience in environmental sustainability, with an interest in the role of business in accelerating the uptake of low and zero carbon solutions. So she established MECLA, which stands for the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, and includes over 150 companies and organizations collaborating to reduce embodied carbon in the construction and infrastructure sectors, so that we align things in those sectors with the Paris Agreement objectives. Previously, she worked with WWF. She also co-chairs an alliance of think tanks and civil society organizations across Japan, Korea, and Australia. So she is not, Greg's not the only one doing work internationally, and is a board member of the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council. I notice Alison from ASBEC is on the call. She was also named a top 100 green power influencer for her impact. So we're very glad to have you here with us today, Monica. And Monica is going to present now on a bit of an Australian perspective on the topic of embodied carbon. I've also asked Monica to focus a little bit on the supply side, given that we're going to hear next from Katie from NABERS, which is focused more on the demand side, and then we can hear more about MECLA and the work that Monica is doing in the panel discussion following that, because obviously Monica doesn't just work on the supply side, it's a whole of economy approach to this problem. So Monica, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And hi, everybody. Lovely to be here with you today. So let's move right along. So just setting the context, the why this is important. This is some work that came out of the World Economic Forum at the beginning of this year. I think 1,300 CEOs around the world surveyed on the things that they're concerned about from a risk point of view, and four of those are climate and biodiversity related. So the urgency of these issues is very fundamental to shifting the dial. And although they're labelled environmental, they really are societal, technological, and economic. And just to remind us again, the planetary boundaries and where we sit today. So the scale and speed of being able to reduce embodied carbon is fundamental to our very own existence. WWF at the beginning of this year has put together, we asked Maltz Meinhausen and Dr. Zebedee Nicol to help us develop our own recommendations for what a science-based target, which Greg talked about a bit, what a pathway, a fair and equitable pathway for Australia around its nationally determined contributions. And we're encouraging the government to commit to a 67% reduction by 2030, net zero by 2038. So it's well over 70% by 2035, we think is going to be our fair share. So very, very long sense of urgency. So a couple of examples. You've got here 2 councillors from the city of Melbourne. I think the first billboard poster on demonstrating how fantastic they have been in reducing embodied carbon. And this is Queen Victoria Market, so 38% reduction in concrete over business as usual and 20% asphalt. You've got companies like Lend-Lease, of course. They are also, they have been great champions for looking at reductions and a whole range of different materials and really forging the pathway ahead, particularly around their Barangaroo, but some of the other projects as well. Greg covered what do we talk about when we talk about embodied carbon? There's both upfront, there's embodied, there's whole of life. And then when you're talking about circular, we need to be considering the end of life and adaptive reuse as well. So for those of you who aren't familiar with MECLA, you'll be familiar with the need for, a systems intervention. That's really what we are about, driving intervention across the whole of the supply chain for the construction project lifecycle, which you can see at the front, at the top there, from project conception, design, pre-design, all the way through to construction and engineering. You see how important that design element is. It takes up a very significant chunk. So the decisions that are made right at the beginning are fundamental to reducing the embodied carbon in the projects that you are delivering. Our purpose, align with the Paris Agreement targets, principles of the circular economy. And then we do that through, a whole of systems approach. The demand side, fundamental to achieving change. How you measure, Greg talked a lot about that. It's fantastic to see the amount of work that's going on there. Greg, that knowledge sharing, we do a lot of spotlight events, developing common language, an action guide and how you can specify and have consistency. So it's not just one-off projects, but that there is consistency, climate transition risks, and then supporting the materials that go into the built environment. We call ourselves a do tank, so very much about the doing, rolling up our sleeves and getting involved in that. And these slides will be shared with you if you want them, and you could, happy for you to reach out to me at any point in time. And these are our working groups, 10 working groups there right across different parts of the supply chain ecosystem. So a couple of ways that we work before we get into the supply side. I think one of the things we've heard from industry, it's really important to be working closely and early with government on how to put together procurement expectations, provide advice and guidance. So New South Wales government in particular has been very engaged with them over the last 18 months as they develop their policy and framework and measurement and benchmarks. And we participated in a number of those workshops that they've been running, along with many of our MECLA members. And as a result of that, the government was able to tweak the policy recommendations that they had in place. I won't go into that in detail, but you can see some of the changes that were made as a result of that industry input. Here's another example. Working Group 1 on the demand side had a pledge prerequisite, so a pledge for head contractors to have as a minimum an embodied carbon target to tender for government work. And so in May this year, the South Australian government launched their pledge prerequisite procurement policy, and now they're starting to put together some of the meat on the bones to help support the industry so the whole of industry can adapt. And something that we're working on as well is an industry readiness proposal. So being able to have a dashboard to be able to demonstrate to government agencies where industry is ready, where it's not as well, and what some of those challenges are. So hopefully we'll run a pilot test next year. So let's talk about some of the material suppliers. So, each of the working groups has been very busy over the last 12 to 18 months. We've developed a series of steel snapshots so you can understand, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, responsible steel is one of the certification processes. We've got a 10-page brochure. And we also, at the beginning of this year, did a deep dive, went for a visit to the BlueScope steel plant, which was so fundamental to really understanding some of the major challenges that steel faces. We know, it's a chemistry problem ultimately, and, the solutions are complex. That's why they're called the hard to abate sector. So you need to be moving beyond blast furnace. How do you do that? The use of hydrogen-based production, replacing coal and gas, replacing power sources. And there's complexity around the quality of iron ores as well. So I've got some details here about what Australian steel makers are doing. They're certainly not sitting on their hands. We've got BlueScope, really engaging quite deeply in this in a whole range of different ways. The GFG Alliance in South Australia, moving, closing down their blast furnace and moving towards a electric arc furnace. You've got other electric arc furnaces starting to be thought about here in different parts of Australia, and particularly WA, and foreign investors looking at this as well. So that bodes well for Australian steel manufacturers to be shifting. Now, of course, steel needs iron ore to be able to make iron for the steel production. So we've had our major iron ore miners, Rio Tinto, BHP, Fortescue, are all very heavily invested in trying to research how the Pilbara ores, which are a lower quality ore generally, how they can be adapted for green steel technologies. And again, I won't go through this in detail, but you can have access to this later. And the Science Based Targets Initiative also has released this year their standard expectations for companies that are steel producers to be setting their targets based on the latest science for the sector, which is very ambitious, but I think it provides a really good pathway for the steel sector. So that's steel. Let's move on to some concrete and cement. I had a meeting just before our webinar now, and Evan and Ali as our chairs. And, there are about 35 very active members here. We've held a number of events, including myth busting. There's a lot of myths to be busted around concrete and in the concrete space. And we're also developing a guide to low carbon concrete in Australia. So watch this space. We'll have something out hopefully in the first or second quarter of this year. And of course, for the concrete suppliers, the big challenges for them, and I guess for engineering organisations, is how they manage and reduce Scope 3 emissions. And certainly, companies like Laing O'Rourke, Lend-Lease, there are many of the tier 1 head contractors are working with their supply chain. They're educating people on the plant, on how to use lower carbon materials, lower carbon concrete. It might have longer curing time. It might be a bit wetter, and all of those things result in different complexities and challenges for the projects, which can create delays, which create costs, of course. And then there's alternatives. You've got polymers, carbon reinforced polymers that can go into an alternative to traditional concrete structures, which I know, Australia is heavily invested, starting to look at this area as well. So focused on aluminium, also very, very big energy intensive material. The Aluminium Working Group has put together a specifications guide. That was with the generous help of Lend-Lease and some of the work that they were doing on their major projects and some of the learnings. And I think that's key for suppliers to recognise that they're upstream, so the head contractors can be asking for it. So in the case of Lend-Lease with their Barangaroo project, when they originally went out to the market to look for low carbon aluminium, it was like 3 times the price. The second tower was double the price, and by the time they got to the third tower, the market said, "Oh, I think they're serious about this." Well, and they've managed to source their low carbon aluminium at more or less an equivalent price. I mean, obviously, it wasn't material to the final project. So being able to also know that it is now available in Australia, So Locale is the Caprol product. Caprol, the largest aluminium extruder in Australia. They sort of saw the writings on the wall and they said, okay, well, let's see if we can produce some low aluminium window frames, door frames, and they have this now in the marketplace in Australia, which was great to see. And of course, there are major opportunities to be thinking about not just primary aluminium, but being able to reuse, secondary aluminium products, recycled aluminium products. And I think over the next 10 years, we'll start to see some investment in recycling facilities here in Australia to be able to allow us to do that. And some very good work that Deloitte did for the aluminium industry to drive that change. So for example, only 25% of aluminium cans are recycled in Australia, and we know how precious that aluminium is. So being able to really capture that is important. Solar panels have a lot of aluminium in there. Some of them are going to be removed because they've reached their age. The other area that's of real interest to us is engineered timber. How do we support greater use of engineered timber, mass timber, posts and beams, flooring systems? Australia could really help to drive decarbonisation on housing and building construction through more use of, plantation-based engineered timber products. There are a few challenges, as I've identified there: insurance, supply chain, logistics, but there is a possibility to really look at timber products in Australia going forward. We also have a building services working group. So, this is the HVAC and piping and other plant. We did a deep dive tour of the Dakin facilities down in Western Sydney, which was a fantastic half day for us. Really appreciated talking in very deep detail about the challenges. I mean, you imagine air conditioning unit, it has, steel, aluminium, plastic, and then 101 other bits and pieces to it. How do you actually genuinely develop an embodied carbon EPD, for example, for a Dakin product or other products? And I think you've got to start somewhere. And, we said, well, you can start with the top 3 materials, do your hotspot analysis, make sure that at least you're sourcing your materials, or are starting to ask the questions of your suppliers of those materials, and then you can start to move forward. And of course, starting to think about circular and different kinds of materials. This photograph here is a whole range of wind turbines that were just put into landfill in Germany, not in Australia. And really, if we can think about using, well, in this case, it was EcoBoard and other different types of materials, composite fibers, etc., we can really start to see a reduction in embodied carbon over time. So I didn't want to leave the conversation without us, I know, Greg, you covered the measurement really well, but, we have done a deep discussion paper on the different complexities, benchmarks, frameworks around how you measure embodied carbon. And, it's a very important element to getting this right, so we can, compare apples with apples. Looking forward to hearing an update from Katie. And finally, government is a deep and wide enabler here to drive change, both through policy, but also through procurement practices. And you need to be able to take some risks, share those risks, and enable that cross-collaboration with industry and government to drive the decarbonisation forward. This is from Queensland, Transport and Main Roads, turning innovation into business as usual, and that's what really need to be driving that to achieve any major change. They're our members and supporters, and thank you. I'll put my contact details into the chat, and you can reach out if you want to have any questions. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Monica. And I'm going to jump straight into our next presentation now and leave questions, as I said, to the end. So our next presenter is Katie Eyles. She works on accelerating net zero buildings at NABERS, and her team has been developing an embodied carbon rating tool. that will be the national standard for measuring, verifying, and comparing the embodied carbon in new buildings and major refurbishments. So we're shifting now to the demand side, and this is one of the ways in which the demand side can drive change and demand for lower embodied carbon materials in buildings. So Katie, I'll hand the floor to you, and looking forward to hearing this, and then we will have our discussion following this. So hang on the line for those of you, and I would encourage you to put questions in the Q&A and upvote existing questions as well, so that we can get to those. Thank you, Katie.
Perfect, thanks, Jeremy. I will just share my screen. So let's talk about the work that NABERS is doing to create a embodied carbon rating system, which can help the building industry measure and reduce embodied carbon. So just some context of who NABERS is in case, or what NABERS is in case anyone isn't too familiar with us. NABERS rates Australian buildings for sustainability. So for example, if you have a NABERS energy rating, operational energy rating for your building, and it's a 3-star rating, that means that you have average energy consumption compared to a similar building to you. NABERS is Australia's largest building sustainability initiative. We have about 70 people in our team, and for context, nearly every large office tower around Australia has a NABERS rating of some kind, whether that's energy, water, waste, or we also do indoor air quality as well. So the sectors that are currently covered by NABERS energy ratings, for example, we cover quite a lot of building types. And I think it's worth just taking a quick look at an example of how rating NABERS every year can help you understand your energy use and reduce it over time. So for example, looking back at our data over the years, we can see that offices, by the time they have been doing energy rating for 10 years, they're using 33% less energy on average than what they were when they were doing their first rating. So that's a little bit about the NABERS rating system and how it helps people monitor and track and improve. And obviously now moving on to embodied carbon, we're hoping to have good results there too, along the same vein. So we started looking at embodied carbon a couple of years ago because obviously it's a very important step in reaching net zero. And we know that as time goes on, the proportion of emissions associated with a building that are embodied emissions is growing. This is data from a study that the Green Building Council did in 2019. And we're seeing new data now, only a few years later, which is already showing us that embodied carbon is making up about 50%. So moving quite quickly towards the right there. So yeah, what have we been doing to get started in this space? We've spent the last couple of years working with hundreds of people from hundreds of organizations across the building industry. So everyone from developers, owners, architects, engineers, policymakers, investors, and also the supply side, product manufacturers. What we've been doing while working with everyone is coming up with a set of principles for what a national standard for embodied carbon should involve. So those principles are effectively the 10 big decisions that we need to make as an industry on what and how to measure embodied carbon. So a couple of examples of those kinds of principles are: what kinds of emissions data is it appropriate to use? How much of the building should we be measuring? For example, do we focus on the big things such as concrete and steel, and maybe that's a bit more practical than trying to go after everything, or should we actually be trying to measure down to wall and floor coverings and all the details of electrical and plumbing in every tenancy and floor? So yeah, those are the kinds of things we've been discussing with everyone in this group. And the outcome was that we put out a public consultation paper with 10 principles for what an embodied carbon rating tool should involve. And those we'll talk through some of those principles in the rest of this presentation. But the good news is, after working so closely with industry for a couple of years, you know, at the beginning, we're thinking, wow, embodied carbon is such a huge, complex problem, and there's so many different stakeholders with competing needs. How on earth are we actually going to get to a place where we all broadly agree? It seemed very challenging, like a massive uphill battle. But the good news is, in response to that public consultation, the feedback we got was 85% of individuals and companies who responded to that consultation paper said they were likely or very likely to either use or encourage use of a NABERS embodied carbon rating tool if we did it in accordance with those principles that we all came up with together. So yeah, we're in a good position now to actually be building the tool and getting into more of the details. So just an example of the main objectives that we've been looking to achieve as we go through this process with industry. Number one, to drive action to urgently reduce embodied emissions, just get started ASAP. Second of all, focusing on measuring, verifying that what's measured is correct and comparable with other buildings or other materials, and then disclosing so that everyone can be aware of what's going on in the market, compare themselves with others, see on the whole what needs to be done. And then the third one there is, yeah, get started. Start by solving well-defined problems now. Obviously, in the embodied carbon space, there are so many problems to solve. Some of them we know how to solve now, some of them we're still working on. So let's get started by solving what we can solve now and start making a difference. And then we have a roadmap for future development where we keep on going with the other things that aren't solvable yet. So yeah, let's talk about a few of the main proposals that are probably interesting for this group. So proposal number one that we agreed on with industry, the NABERS embodied carbon standard will focus on new buildings and major refurbishments when it's first released. So by new buildings, we mean anything that was completed in around the last 5 years, you could get a rating for. And then obviously going forward, any new buildings. There was demand for being able to look at fit outs over time, for example, and those kinds of things are in our roadmap, but at the beginning, new buildings and major refurbishments. And then secondly here, what we're looking at for the NABERS tool is upfront emissions. So that is those A1 to A5 stages that Monica and Greg showed in their slides. So yeah, we're talking about upfront emissions from the phase of extracting materials, making the building materials, and then completing construction. The reason why we went with upfront emissions was that if we were looking at whole of life, there are a lot of assumptions about what might happen in the future. And we really wanted to be focused on solving the big critical problem that we have right now, which is making better decisions in design and construction, and really, yeah, really getting started on that big problem at the moment of making better construction decisions. And industry broadly agreed on this, but there was obviously a fair bit of demand for being able to understand whole of life. So what we'll do is when we release the tool, we will include whole of life calculations. So it will be possible for project teams to do some modeling, look at what the whole of life picture is and make decisions based on that. It's just that whole of life won't be included in the actual star rating. So yeah, whole of life available to calculate and play around with, just not part of the star rating. And in terms of getting whole of life into the star rating, we'll look at that a bit further down the track after the first release of the tool. Then thirdly, another important one, yeah, what emissions data are you able to use if you're doing an embodied carbon rating with NABERS? So what we're requiring is verified product specific data. So what that means for the most part is environmental product declarations using EPDs that are created according to the international standard, or other data that is verified in a way that meets that international standard, has the same system boundaries so it can be compared, or so that it's comparable. So a little about emissions data. Of course, we understand that not every product has an EPD at the moment, and there are some areas where there are big gaps, such as building services, for example. Some building services, very complex, thousands of parts. So at the moment, we're lacking emissions data for those. So what NABERS is doing to fill those gaps is we're creating an emission factors database. The way that we're creating this is by collecting all of the EPD and other appropriate verified data that we can find for materials that are available to use in construction in Australia. So that means materials created in Australia and also materials that are imported and used here. And based on all of that data that we collect, we're creating both an average and a conservative default emission factor for all of the product types that you might have in a building that you might need to use in a NABERS rating. So some examples of those product types are on the screen here. So for example, concrete by different strengths, different types of steel, different types of timber will have an average and a conservative default emission factor for each of those different product types. The reason for having both average and conservative, the average figure will be useful for project teams if they're in the earlier design phases of a building and they're kind of playing around and looking at what might be possible if they used products that have EPDs or products that have verified product-specific data. And the conservative default emission factors are what you will use in the NABERS rating if you've used products that don't have EPDs. And the reason why the default emission factors to be used in the NABERS rating are conservative is because we know that if you're using a product that doesn't have an EPD, it's likely to be worse than average in terms of emissions. So we don't want to be certifying buildings as being better than they actually are. So in terms of making this database, we're working really closely with industry to make sure that we get the breakdown of product types right and to make sure that we have all the data we need to do it. Over November and December, we've been having workshops with product manufacturers, for example, to collect all of that information. And next year, we'll continue to be having workshops with various other people like life cycle assessment analysts and project teams. And importantly, this database, we will make it available publicly free of charge so that everyone can use it because the most important thing that we've kept hearing throughout this whole process is alignment. Make it possible for everyone to be aligned across Australia using the same things, buildings and infrastructure, so that everyone knows what to do and you're not trying to do different things for different rating schemes or different governments. So, and actually, I'll just also mention on this, we will be keeping this up to date over time because it will be, we'd have to anyway, because it will be necessary for getting a NABERS rating to use these default figures if you don't have EPDs. So yeah, it will always be the kind of the latest, based on the latest data available. And then the last one, which I thought it would be good just to mention is that, what this is doing is introducing a national benchmark for comparing buildings. So that is that star rating, which I showed at the beginning, so that you can compare and contrast and know where you sit in the market. You'll know that if you have a 3-star rating, your building is about average in terms of emissions. And if you have a 6-star rating, you have about 70 to 80% less emissions than a similar building. So we're continuing to work really closely with industry as we go through this process, you know, in terms of figuring out emission factors, collecting data to do that benchmarking, and piloting as well in a few months. So if you haven't been involved yet and you would like to be, yeah, please reach out to me anytime. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in having a look at the details or the technical papers that we've published, you can just Google NABERS Embodied Carbon and find our public consultation page, which has all of those details on it. We're aiming to launch the tool in mid-2024. And yeah, thank you. Please reach out anytime if you'd like to chat.
Thank you, Katie, and it's very exciting to hear that the tool is only 6 months away, really. So I'm sure you've got a lot of things to do between now and then, but it's very exciting for Australia, to be honest. So I'm going to now ask my panelists who haven't turned their cameras on to do so, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion. There's nothing in the Q&A at the moment. I have plenty of questions myself, so I'm going to start at the high international level here and go back to Greg. And Greg, you had a couple of examples in your slides of some leaders. I think you had the UK in there, and Denmark was another one I caught a glimpse of as well. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what the leading countries internationally are doing on embodied carbon and what makes them leading. What is it that they've got in place that makes their efforts really impressive? And you're muted, Greg.
I've actually answered it while I'm muted, so I'm not repeating myself, Jeremy. Anyway, sorry. We have impressions which ones are kind of advanced. For example, and I lived in Germany 10 years ago, and even like 10 to 15 years ago, Germany already had a database, and it was included in their first rating system, DGNB and BNB. And the structure of this rating system in Germany for buildings is different because it's already a second or third generation compared to LEED and BREEAM and also our green stars. It's a different structure. And the reason it was already in their rating system is because they already have the data set that was industry and pooled over time. But then when you actually get there, you find out that France, for example, and several other countries also have a similar thing. And that's the reason why it's already practiced before it became a requirement in the voluntary system. Yeah, it's already there in the voluntary system. And then, of course, Germany had the BNB for all federal buildings. So when they released the DGNB, there's the same structure of the BNB rating system, and using the same database, but the BNB is required for all federal government buildings. And so the industry was kind of trained to supply that. And then you have the voluntary for the market, which is the DGNB. So that's one thing. And so
Greg, just can I ask you? You said BNB. Can you tell me what that stands
Yes,
for?
sorry. These are just the rating systems in Germany. DGNB is the equivalent to our green stars and LEED in the US and so on. But the architecture of this DGNB and BNB are almost exactly the same. The difference is in the name. And this was actually architected by Thomas Lutskendorf, who was my friend and colleague. In fact, the framework on EN that everyone uses was also architected by Thomas Lutskendorf. You know, that B1, A1, A2, C thing, that was framed by Thomas Lutskendorf himself. But anyway, he was the architect of the structure of the GNB and BNB. And BNB is the one that's used by government. Gotcha. For their government projects. Yeah, so the point is that by doing, which is an answer to the written question I said, because when government requires it of their own project, it forces the industry, both manufacturers and the designers and engineers and consultants to be able to deliver those, right, to government. And therefore, they train themselves to be able to train them to the private market. to the market as
yeah,
well.
I mean, that's a good point. And this is something that Monica raised as well, that the driver for action often comes from government procurement itself.
Yeah.
Just while we're getting on to sort of we'll leave the policy discussion for a little bit longer. I just want to focus a little bit on data, and this kind of relates a little bit to the question that's come up as well, but maybe we'll answer that question from Alison in a second. But I just want to talk about data for a second, because I think in Greg's answer, he was sort of saying, you know, there was good voluntary data already there in places like Germany, and then these government schemes as well encouraged more production of data, or
Yes.
at least encourage more demand for
Yes.
better quality products as well. What's the state of Australian? Sorry, my camera's just dropped out. I think you can still hear me. What's the state of Australian data on embodied carbon at the moment in building products? And I'm opening that up to Katie or Monica, perhaps, because Katie, you've just been deep into this as well as part of your project. How would you characterize the state of data on embodied carbon in Australia at the moment?
Yeah, it depends on the material type. So, you know, for something like concrete or steel, we have a lot of good data, although, you know, even within those areas, it kind of depends on the product type within steel or the product type within concrete. For some areas, there are big gaps, like HVAC systems, for example. But I think we're finding even where we're finding gaps in terms of EPDs, we are able to find data from other studies that are helping us to build, you know, a database that everyone can use, which will have the most recent information in it. Yeah, and I think the main thing for us is incentivizing manufacturers to get verified data to get EPDs if they don't. So by using those conservative defaults in our rating system, it gives people the option to you know, use product-specific data to know if they're choosing something that has lower emissions, and to incentivize knowing and using something with an EPD so that manufacturers are incentivized to get them.
Monica, do you want to weigh in on that question as well around the state of data, and maybe leading on from that, because Katie's just talked about how incentivizing companies to get EPDs done is one way of creating more data, I suppose, as well. What are you hearing from your members at MECLA around the quality of data and challenges, I suppose, in getting it?
I think they're finding that there are a lot of challenges. So, you know, for the big end of town, there certainly is, and, you know, traditional materials, there is, you know, the EPDs available. It's costly to do an EPD, and you have to do it and update it for every single new product that you have. So I think, you know, I've heard from concrete suppliers that they have, you know, every single mix needs to have an EPD, which is very time consuming. And it probably doesn't capture, I mean, you know, all of the issues that need to be captured, because you're talking about materials rather than necessarily talking about, you know, whole of life carbon for a whole building or a piece of infrastructure, for example. But I think, you know, we have to start somewhere, and, you know, hopefully there'll be a digitization of the EPD process to make that more simple, and that's probably, you know, where the NABERS project comes into it as well.
Yeah, we're trying to find other ways to make it, you know, other appropriate ways to make it work as well. So, for example, if a concrete company has the data for every mix, but it's just not verified yet, how might we find a way that they can do that in, you know, a reasonable cost and time? Yeah.
Greg, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Let me just put it down. Just because we've been dealing with this for 25 years. And one of our first databases in Australia was developed 20 years ago. So the state of New South Wales had one, and then RMIT and CSIRO. So we had at CSIRO a database. And then later on, Graham Treloar, who was in Deakin at the time, developed the hybrid, which is now the basis for Robert Crawford and also the EPIC database. The point is that we've been doing a lot of this at the research level for a long time, so we can do it. And then, of course, you have the volume and the major materials that Monica's talking about. If you capture that, because it's the Pareto principle, isn't it? You really want to capture the bulk first, and you can add to that and improve it over time. And that's why I was interested in the latest information that both Katie and Monica are talking about, because we can do this 20 years ago. We improved that database. We ran different types of studies in the past with BPEC and the Forest and Wood Products Association. Some of them we did at CSRO, and I was the leader of the team. And then we established the Australian Life Cycle Inventory. Again, that's an initiative that I initiated then for the reason that Kate is talking about, because the idea was that we need a set that is, at least in the process-based, that is has both a literature background, kind of expert information settings that are available by class of materials, yeah, as a basis. And so agree with the approach that NABERS has on this conservative and average. And the reason exactly is that if you'd like better than conservative or average, that's the incentive to do your product at EPD. Yeah, so that's the idea. If otherwise, you go down to these layers of defaults. And if you don't have anything, then your default is the conservative. And so that improves. And so this is the part of asking about the scope 3 emissions, right? Everyone's talking about scope 3 emissions. This is what I'm saying, because when you set your targets and minimize your embodied carbon, it cleans the supply chain. It has, someone's scope 1 is someone else's scope 3, right? And so when that's the reason why embodied carbon is so powerful, because it can help clean up the supply chain and reduce the footprint.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that discussion around somebody's scope 1 being somebody's scope 3, because there's a lot of policy work happening, particularly at the federal level, where that becomes a real headache for policymakers. And so I know some of them are on the line here. I think we could get into that discussion in a second. I want to get to Alison's question now, which is in the chat. And her question was, what do you think the biggest challenges are to having the NABERS approach to be implemented across the Australian built environment at scale? Now, this is noting the fact that NABERS, for those of you on the call who maybe aren't aware, is really applicable to the commercial and tertiary building sector, I'll call it. But of course, the built environment is much more than those buildings. We have all of the homes that we occupy and all the infrastructure that's constructed by governments and others. And so the question is, how applicable, I suppose, might the NABERS approach be to the rest of the built environment? Does anyone want to have a crack at that one?
First.
You've been named, Katie.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of what it can cover building wise, we're aiming for it to be able to be used for any building type. Obviously there's some issues there in terms of if you're talking about a single standalone home, like what's the cost benefit between the amount of time required to do all that measurement versus the size of the structure. But I think a couple of the biggest challenges that we're seeing are people in industry available to do the work required. So, for example, life cycle LCA experts, having that built into processes in project teams when they're building new buildings. Getting enough industry folks trained up to do all the work that is required for having the data that we need and doing the ratings. Yeah.
I'll add a comment in there, and it reminds me of a conversation I had with some of the local council members of MECLA. They were saying, well, we do a lot of civil and linear infrastructure right across Australia, and there's a number of different emissions factors that go into trying to assess what our emissions are for those projects, because many councils, they've set carbon neutral targets as well. So they're looking for a database where they can draw some emissions factors into that. And I assume, Katie, that the local councils will be able to find their emissions factors within that. And I think that will be a very great help for many local councils, because you wouldn't want each local council to be trying to develop its own emissions factors.
Yeah, we're finding so much demand for people to get access to those emission factors database. We'll make it available before the actual full tool is launched. Before the full tool is launched, as soon as those numbers are ready, we'll put them out there for everyone to use.
Fantastic.
That's great. Great news, Katie. There is a chat question from Vince. And it comes back to, well, it's a little bit similar, I suppose, we're talking about databases and the calculations that go into those databases. Vince asks, what can we learn from those countries that are doing embodied carbon well in regards to calculations that we can give to our local product manufacturers? So Vince sounds like he's asking about whether or not there are the option of taking, calculations that may have been done by other countries for products that we probably use here, or products that are similar to those products used overseas. Is there a way that we can adapt lessons from those countries, or indeed take the data maybe directly and incorporate them into our own databases locally? And Greg, Vince also says he's conscious of the fact that there's 25 years of study there, so perhaps you have an answer for this one.
Yeah, I have to qualify that one. That's why I said in research. Yes, because the researchers can make distinctions about the quality of data and how to adjust them, and so on and so forth. And we've encountered, even 10 years ago or more recently, a lot of consultants using the ICE database in the UK. That's why one of the slides I put out was that you completely get the wrong carbon footprint. Yeah, because the intensity are so different, and they cannot make that kind of difference. But I also read that in Vince's question about which countries are doing easy well in a more general terms, there's of course the calculation, because this is an issue even in Europe, you see, because there are countries there that didn't have their own national database, and they were using their neighbors' database. But because they have a common supply of electricity, sometimes not 100%, they're close enough, as an example. But you really need to get your country. That's the key thing. And that's the reason why most of the guidelines are country-based. And then, of course, it's also a basis when you're doing the trade. It's a global industry, right? And that's the reason why in Europe they have the strongest, because across borders with the EPD and now the building product directive and declaration at the building level, not just the product level. But one of the things to finish up your first question is the great example is Denmark, because I started with France and Germany, but actually Denmark is ahead of them now. And amazingly, they sort of became serious 10 years ago when we started Annex 57. And Harpa was the lead of that country coming in, and he put all the problems into Annex 57, Annex 72, and then they run parallel projects that are explicit to them. And so what we were doing in these annexes are helped by their information, and our output they were putting into their country. And now they have the best benchmarks and processes, and they're doing a Nordic alignment coordination. So the place to watch out for, in my view, are the Nordic countries of Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway, because not only do they have national, but they are aligning and harmonizing across them. And I think that will trickle down down to continental Europe, which we should watch. And this is part of my subtask, is to actually set that capability matrix framework I was talking about, capability assessment framework, because then we can compare ourselves to them and find out what's missing or what we need to do to get to that level or to the level of Germany. Yeah, and that's why it's very important, this capability matrix. In other sectors, we call them the maturity model framework.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg. So a couple more questions coming in. I see a question from Richard about cool roofs. That's not really related to embodied carbon per se. It's a question about whether, why so many roofs are still dark instead of light, and that we could benefit from them being light. Obviously, I think most of us on the call would agree that lighter colored roofs are a great thing for energy efficiency. I might ask a question though, maybe anyone on the call available know whether things like the corrugated iron used in roofing, if there are EPDs available for those sort of products at the moment?
Yes.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's good. So that's anyone interested in roofing materials, there are products available that have had EPDs done, so that's a good thing. Lorraine asks, how will low carbon standards apply to offshore wind, as most of the components will be imported? And I think I'd like to broaden this question to be just about imported products in general. So what is the best way of Australia, I suppose, managing the inflow of products? Maybe we don't manufacture particular building products here. And so I'm thinking maybe some of the high performance windows, for example, used in buildings. How do we manage, I suppose, those imported products? Is it just from those products being included in things like the NABERS database? Or do we need other regulatory measures? And conscious of the fact that Australia is currently looking at a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which might be part of the solution here, but I'm just thought I'd open that up to the panel. Monica, you were nodding. Do you have something to add on that question?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is we need a materials database just to know what kind of low carbon materials are available. You know, architects go looking, designers go looking, and I know Architects Declare is working on that with the Green Building Council. You know, they've got a responsible materials database that is being updated at the moment. So, you know, certainly that's important. In terms of, you know, the policy mechanism, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, I know that it is definitely, you know, the industry that I've been talking to are watching that with very great interest, because they're very concerned that, you know, cheap cement coming into Australia with very high embodied carbon could make a project cheaper than cement manufactured here in Australia, but may not be treated fairly. So I know there's some, you know, pretty considerable concerns being faced on that. But yeah, for, you know, other materials, we really need to be thinking about how if, you know, what is our comparative advantage in terms of manufacturing goods here, and, you know, how we can support industry to make that happen.
Yeah, it's a global problem, Jeremy. We've thought about this for a long time, and still some issues in Europe because even though they can look at European manufactured products, it's the same problem we have, that when it comes from a different region with different standards. And that's the reason why we were doing a lot of the global databases by country that's promoted by UNEP. And that's why I got involved in these global LCA databases in different parts and different countries, and where they could start. And it's gone to a level of sophistication now that most countries can start or have something. For example, in China, they have multiple databases, as an example. Now how to treat that is another matter, right? And the border adjustment, certainly, I think that should always be part of the solution because of uncertainties, regardless of whether they have data there or not. And then, of course, is the transport and so on. We did a little study on this before, in particular windows in Australia. So we had Australian buildings and compared the embodied carbon of local versus overseas things. So we've done a number of this, and it can compare when it's favorable to this or not favorable to that, and so on and so forth. At the research level, it's always different. And this is because this is knowledge development, knowledge building. And when we synthesize these things, these are the things that should help NABERS and Katie and the like. Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. And I'm now going to move to the question about policy, which I've been wanting to ask, I suppose. You know, you talked about carrots, sticks, and tambourines. I think it was Greg.
Yes.
And you know, this is a common way of breaking up the types of policies that are available to solve a policy problem. Carrots being the incentives, sticks being regulations, and tambourines being sort of things that make noise, information that helps the market make decisions. So I suppose if I was to ask everyone on the panel this question, because we're getting close to the ends now, what sort of regulatory, or not, I shouldn't say regulatory, what sort of policy response would you like to see put in place to help incentivize lower carbon intensive products into the built environment in Australia? Beyond what we've heard from Katie at NABERS, and noting that someone in the chat actually asked, when will the NABERS EC rating be mandatory? So maybe that's an idea for you, Katie, but just putting the broad question to the panel, what sort of policies, when you look at those carrots, sticks and tambourines, would you like to see in an Australian policy response to decrease embodied carbon emissions? I'll start with you, Katie, perhaps because you're at the top of my screen.
Yeah, sure. I should probably start just by noting that NABERS doesn't. We're not policy. We're the measuring stick that everyone can use in their policies to know what the emissions are or how well a building is doing. I think we've had really great success over time with energy ratings being required, especially at the state government level for government buildings, and those requirements being increased year on year, kind of getting up to 5.5 stars now. So I think that is a great starting point to just require a rating. And then once you have an idea of where the industry is, then you can start thinking about, okay, well, what might we make the requirement in terms of what rating is required? Yeah.
Sounds good. Monica, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking at the deeper end around well, both sticks and carrots. So what about having carbon budgets for any new project? So as Australia commits to, our net zero by 2040, let's say, and you've got the built environment sector, and then we have the carbon budget within that built environment sector for any new projects, buildings, commercial buildings, even residential buildings, infrastructure coming in. What is the carbon budget for that particular project, so that the projects are not just focused on cost and time and quality, but they're focused on carbon and circularity as well. So that'd be my top choice.
That's a good one. And Greg, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was hoping that Monica will shoot for the stars. I'm sure she has a long list of this. But yes, I completely agree with the budget. That is in fact one of the top things in Annex 89. It's a very complex things because, but in any case, I wouldn't open up the issues that we have to face with, but it is the budget that's important, and it starts with the planetary budget. We are aware of the things that that have been breached in the planetary boundaries, and that's why we always look at the limits, and they are in fact interrelated as well. The question, of course, is the allocation to countries, and then of course the sectors. But let's say that we get to the sector. So we needed a measure of how to monitor that at various levels, top down, across, from the sector to the different parts of the sector, to the different elements, and completely agree that it scales. The good thing with budget is it scales. It scales from a product to a building, to a portfolio of buildings, to a city, and to the country, and so on and so forth, by jurisdiction. And it also scales to different stakeholders. So a household can have a budget, a government body can have a budget, a company can have a budget, right? And that's also the way to deal with Scope 3 emissions, And because it does everything like that. It's like you can cut and slice it different ways, but as long as you're within the budget, and everyone knows their budget, then everyone is working for the same purpose. That's how you bring the whole down. It's not the action of one group. It's the action of everyone. Right? So that's why the budget is important. So having said that, how you set this is in progression, obviously, that there will be high-level mandates and legislation and targets that starts with government, really as a minimum. When we do this in the curve, in the normal curve of performance, you have at the bottom your bad players and bad performance. It can be anything, in this case, carbon, right? And then you have the best practice on your right, which is the best performing. What the building regulation and legislation does is that it bans the minimum, it sets the minimum, and it cuts cuts the bad performance. And so you start with that because that would be the minimum, and it progressively should move up. And that's the Denmark model. On the other hand, incentives push the best practice and the best outcomes on the right. But the thing is, even that one should push forward. Yeah, so the incentive pushes, the minimum pushes, so the whole bulk pushes to the right until you get there. And it should be in an aggressive manner. In terms of practicality, there are elements that need to be voluntary initially that become mandatory over time as part of this movement of minimum standards. But in particular, you can already mandate the big projects like we did, for example, for reporting commercial building performance, that if you're of this size, a major size, and that can go with embodied carbon as well, that it's mandatory if you are in a big project because of the impact of that project. And then over time, it becomes mandatory for all. But I think the big bulk of the issue, if we're talking about absolute emissions, is really the existing buildings, yeah, because it's 95% of the stock, and then it will be there for a long time, and so on and so forth. So a lot of effort needs to be done, and you can have your payback carbon, which is the balance between your operating and embodied when you are renovating, for example. And there should be incentive for that, because anything that you don't build is better than new, even though you have a low footprint. There are many more, but that I stop there.
Thanks, Greg. I heard every policy under the sun there, but just to sum up, throughout the discussion today, I think we heard there's a need for good data. And so that's one of the starting pieces, and Australia does have that on the way now with this new database. But of course, Greg mentioned the 20 plus years of research has been done to assemble data as well. So that's good to hear. We're not starting from scratch, and the release of the NABERS tool is going to be really exciting from that perspective. Carbon budgets are important, and I would just probably highlight the fact that the government federally is about to do these 6 sector decarbonisation plans. They're going to be modelled as well, and presumably the modelling will have to set a carbon budget so to be consistent with Paris. And so each of the sector decarbonisation plans, one of which is built environment, one of which is industry, and another that is infrastructure, that are all related to this topic of embodied carbon, will presumably have some sort of carbon budget allocation. So that is kind of the start of that process as far as I can see, and it will kind of bring us into line with other countries that do that sort of sectoral-based carbon budget model when they look forward and set their emissions reduction targets. UK is a great example there. And obviously targets were mentioned as well, and the government is setting those targets based on this modelling. Government procurement came up early in the conversation as well. Monica mentioned that one, and the power of government procurement to drive change, given the government is such a big investor in assets and infrastructure, as well as an owner and leaser of assets. And so it's really encouraging to see that the federal government recently released their APS net zero policy. State governments as well have had policies very similar to this. So now that the rubber is in the road, I think there'll be a lot of government asset managers asking for assistance as to how they actually do this and how they do the calculations. But it's really great to see that those policies are in place now. Finally, Greg just mentioned at the end there that, voluntary tools have a role to play, and tools like the NABERS tool being voluntary are really important, but they can also actually drive change through the fact that you have these conservative factors and average factors, for example, and then that can itself be an incentive to drive even people taking the voluntary assessment to go and get an EPD, improve the data for Australia. And then eventually that can transition to mandatory measures and regulatory measures as well. And in Australia, our experience with mandatory disclosure is a classic example, where we started with a voluntary rating scheme and then moved to mandatory disclosure. So perhaps that will happen with carbon, embodied carbon as well. We should wrap up, but we've gone over time by a minute, but I'd like to thank everyone. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you, Katie, Monica and Greg for sharing your insights. I'm sure if people on the call have questions, you'd be happy to answer those following this, and I think we'll make your slides available in some format too. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on the call. It was really great to see such a high level of participation today for this topic, and stay tuned for more of these to come in the new year, because the IEA EBC has plenty of research going on beyond this task. There are various annexes, as they're called, across the building sector, and the EEC will be running more webinars next year. So thanks again for your participation, and thanks to our panelists. See you in the new year.